in Staten Island on July 17th.
Straight to New York to Police Commissioner James O'Neill.
It is a decision that necessarily requires fairness and impartiality for Mr. Garner, who died following that encounter with police. It is also a decision that requires fairness and impartiality for Officer Pantaleo, who was sent by this department to assess the situation and take appropriate police action. First, I will discuss how I reached my decision, and then I will answer any questions you have on the topic. For some time prior to July 17, 2014, neighborhood residents purposely avoided the area in and directly around Tompkinsville Park in Staten Island. The conditions at that time arose from an array of criminal activity. Drug dealers worked the edges of the park, and across the street, selling narcotics. A handful of men regularly sold loose cigarettes made cheaper by the fact that New York State taxes had not been paid on them. A liquor store nearby sold alcohol to people who would drink that alcohol in the park. People who would sometimes use drugs, urinate, and pass out on benches there. That summer, the week before there had been reports of theft and 2 robberies in the park, there were 911, 311, and other complaints from residents and merchants on an ongoing basis. In some cases, warnings or summonses were issued. In other cases, arrests were made. And that was the situation at Tompkinsville Park on the day Officer Pantaleo was sent with another officer to conduct an enforcement operation. When the second officer observed Mr. Garner hand out cigarettes in exchange for money, they approached Mr. Garner to make an arrest. That offense could have resulted in a summons, but Mr. Garner refused to provide identification, which meant he would have been brought to the precinct for processing. For several minutes on that widely viewed video, Mr. Garner makes it abundantly clear that he will not go willingly with the police officers. He refused to cooperate with the arrest and to comply with lawful orders. The video also makes clear that Officer Pantaleo's original efforts to take Mr. Garner into custody were appropriate, and that he initially attempted 2 maneuvers sanctioned by the police department. Officer Pantaleo first grabbed Mr. Garner's right wrist and attempted an armbar technique in preparation for handcuffs to be used. Mr. Garner immediately twisted and pulled and raised both of his hands while repeatedly telling the officers to not touch him. Officer Pantaleo then wrapped his arms around Mr. Garner's upper body. Up to that point in this tense and rapidly evolving situation, there was nothing to suggest that Officer Pantaleo attempted to place Mr. Garner in a chokehold. But what happened next is the matter we must address. The 2 men stumbled backward towards the large plate glass window, the storefront behind them, and Officer Pantaleo's back made contact with the glass, causing the window to visibly buckle and warp. The person videotaping the episode later testified at the NYPD trial that he thought both men would crash through the glass. It is at that point in the video that Officer Pantaleo is seen with his hands clasped together and his left forearm pressed against Mr. Garner's neck in what constitutes a chokehold. The NYPD court ruled that while certainly not preferable, that hold was acceptable during that brief moment in time because the risk of falling through the window was so high. But that exigent circumstance no longer existed, the court found, when Officer Pantaleo and Mr. Garner moved to the ground. As Mr. Garner balanced himself on the sidewalk on his hands and knees, Deputy Commissioner of Trials Rosemarie Maldonado found that Officer Pantaleo consciously disregarded the substantial and unjustifiable risk of maneuver explicitly prohibited by the department. She found that during the struggle, Officer Pantaleo had the opportunity to readjust his grip from a prohibited chokehold to a less lethal alternative, but did not make use of that opportunity. Instead, even once Mr. Garner was moved to his side on the ground, with his left arm behind his back and his right hand still open and extended, Officer Pantaleo kept his hands clasped and maintained the chokehold. Mr. Garner's obvious distress is confirmed when he coughs and grimaces. Moreover, Trials Commissioner Maldonado found that Officer Pantaleo's conduct caused physical injury that meets the penal law threshold and that his recklessness caused multi-layered internal bruising and hemorrhaging that impaired Mr. Garner's physical condition and caused substantial pain and was a significant factor in triggering an asthma attack. For all of these reasons, taken together, even after reviewing Officer Pantaleo's commendable service record of nearly 300 arrests and 14 department medals earned leading up to that day, Trial Commissioner Maldonado recommended that he be dismissed from the department. In making this penalty recommendation, she wrote, this tribunal recognizes that from the outset, Mr. Garner was non-compliant, compliant, and argumentative, and further notes that the patrol guide allows officers to use reasonable force when necessary to take an uncooperative individual into custody. What the patrol guide did not allow, however, even when this individual was resisting arrest, was the use of a prohibited chokehold. As you know, a number of external authorities have asked many of the same questions we have about this incident. On August 19, 2014, about a month after Mr. Garner's death, the Staten Island District Attorney's Office announced it would impanel a grand jury and present evidence on that matter. On December 3, 2014, those 23 Staten Island residents voted to not indict Officer Pantaleo, clearing him of criminal wrongdoing. That same day, the United States Attorney General announced that the U.S. Department of Justice would conduct its own investigation into Mr. Garner's death and way bringing federal civil rights charges against Officer Pantaleo. In the intervening years, the Justice Department made ongoing requests to the NYPD, asking us to delay our internal disciplinary process until its civil rights investigation was complete. And we honored those requests as their process stretched from one administration to the next, with no action by federal prosecutors. And so on July 21, 2018, we decided to begin NYPD proceedings. Members of the public in general, and Mr. Garner's family in particular, have grown understandably impatient. The trial began on May 13, 2019. On July 16, 2019, one day before the 5-year statute of limitations expired, the Justice Department announced it would not file federal charges against Officer Pantaleo. Then, on August 2, 2019, with Officer Pantaleo's NYPD trial concluded, Trials Commissioner Maldonado ruled that Officer Pantaleo's use of a prohibited chokehold was reckless and constituted a gross deviation from the standard of conduct established for a New York City police officer. After noting that Officer Pantaleo had admitted he was aware that chokeholds are prohibited by the department, she further concluded, with strongly worded and repeated warnings about the potentially lethal effects of chokeholds found throughout multiple sections of the training materials, it is evident that the department made its 2006 recruits keenly aware of the inherent dangers associated with the application of pressure to the neck. Given this training, a New York City police officer could reasonably be expected to be aware of the potentially lethal effects connected with the use of a prohibited chokehold and be vigilant in eschewing its use. From the start of this process, I was determined to carry out my responsibility as police commissioner unaffected by public opinions demanding one outcome over another. I examined the totality of the circumstances and relied on the facts. And I stand before you today confident that I have reached the correct decision. And that has certainly not made it an easy decision. I served for nearly 34 years as a New York City cop before becoming police commissioner. I can tell you that had I been in Officer Pantaleo's situation, I may have made similar mistakes. And had I made those mistakes, I would have wished I had used the arrival of backup officers to give the situation more time to make that arrest. And I would have wished that I had released my grip before it became a chokehold. Every time I watch that video, I say to myself, as probably all of you do, to Mr. Garner, don't do it. Comply. To Officer Pantaleo, don't do it. I said that about the decisions made by both Officer Pantaleo and Mr. Garner. But none of us can take back our decisions, most especially when they lead to the death of another human being. I was not in Officer Pantaleo's situation that day. I was chief of patrol, and later that year, chief of department. In that position, I proposed our neighborhood policing model so that the same cops would be in the same neighborhoods every day, so that relationships would replace preconceptions, so that problem solving and prevention would become tools officers were trained in and supported in using. And therefore, one of the great challenges of the police profession here in New York City and elsewhere will always remain arresting someone who intends to resist that arrest. Communication and de-escalation techniques are employed where possible, but more often than the police and the public alike would prefer, varying levels of force are used to ensure compliance. Society gives our police the legal authority to use acceptable levels of force when necessary because police cannot otherwise do their job. Every day in New York, people receive summonses or are arrested by officers without any physical force being used. But some people choose to verbally and/or physically resist the enforcement action lawfully being taken against them. Those situations are unpredictable and dangerous to everyone involved. The street is never the right place to argue the appropriateness of an arrest. That is what our courts are for. Being a police officer is one of the hardest jobs in the world. That is not a statement to elicit sympathy from those we served. It's a fact. Cops have to make choices, sometimes very quickly, every single day. Some are split-second, life and death choices. Oftentimes, they are choices that will be thoroughly and repeatedly examined by those with much more time to think about them than the police officer had. And those decisions are scrutinized and second-guessed, both fairly and unfairly. No one believes that Officer Pantaleo got out of bed on July 17, 2014, thinking he would make choices and take actions during an otherwise routine arrest that would lead to another person's death. But an officer's choices and actions, even made under extreme pressure, matter. It is unlikely that Mr. Garner thought he was in such poor health that a brief struggle with the police would cause his death. He should have decided against resisting arrest, but a man with a family lost his life, and that is an irreversible tragedy. And a hardworking police officer with a family, a man who took this job to do good, to make a difference in his home community, has now lost his chosen career. And that is a different kind of tragedy. In this case, the unintended consequence of Mr. Garner's death must have a consequence of its own. Therefore, I agree with the Deputy Commissioner of Trials' legal findings and recommendations. It is clear that Daniel Pantaleo can no longer effectively serve as a New York City police officer. In carrying out the court's verdict in this case, I take no pleasure. I know that many will disagree with this decision, and that is their right. There are absolutely no victors here today. Not the Garner family, not the community at large, and certainly not the courageous men and women of the police department who put their own lives on the line every single day in service and to the people of this great city. Today is a day of reckoning, but can also be a day of reconciliation. We must move forward together as one city, determined to secure safety for all New Yorkers and safety for every police officer working daily to protect all of us. I'll now take your questions.
Commissioner, even though you had Rosemary Maldonado's decision from a couple of weeks ago, you touched on this. The decision, as you said, was very difficult. And if you could address the rumors that have been running around for the last couple of days, that it was so difficult that you had decided you would rather leave the department rather than make this decision today. Completely untrue.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about rumors. Let's talk about the decision that Rosemary made, the decision that was affirmed by Deputy Commissioner Tucker, and the decision I just made you today.
How difficult then was it?
It's an extremely difficult decision.
When did you actually make this decision? Was this up to the wire, or had you made this decision a couple of days ago?
Hey, Mark, I think you know me long enough by now that this was not an easy decision. It's not something that I could make over a few hours. You know, I've been thinking about this since the day I was sworn in as police commissioner. So it's the decision was made in the last couple of days. Tony?
Commissioner, has any determination been made about any pension rights or benefits?
Yeah, he's being terminated, so whatever contributions he made to the pension system, he'll get back. Marcia, hold on.
I know this is a really hard decision for you. I also know that past leadership said that if you made the decision that you made, you could lose the support of the rank and file. And I wonder, I know you just talked about reconciliation. Are you worried about losing the support of the rank and file? And what do you say to them to make them understand why you had to make this decision?
So immediately, I'm sending out my remarks and the video of this press conference so they know what you all know. And I've been a cop a long time. And if I was still a cop, I'd probably be mad at me. I would. You're not looking out for us. But I am. It's my responsibility as police commissioner to look out for the city and certainly to look out for the New York City police officers. They took this job to make a difference. And you all know the city's been transformed. We've had a lot of help, but it's the cops out there right now and the thousands that have come before us that continue to make this city safe. Some will be angry, and I have a great executive staff. These police officers do a terrific job each and every day, and we'll have to work through this. It's a resilient organization.
Are you asking them to understand that you did this because you believe in the police department?
I did this based on the evidence and testimony at the trial.
Commissioner, our understanding is that negotiations went back and forth Friday and Saturday, and that at one point you were either told or instructed by City Hall that things had to go a certain way. Can you
No, that's not, this is my decision. There are a couple possible outcomes, but this is the decision that the police commissioner makes. And this is a disciplinary case, like other disciplinary cases, and it's my decision. Rocco, I'm going to get to you in a second. Hold on. Rocco.
Did you follow the trial day by day, or did you wait till the end of the trial? And then you talk about what you reviewed.
Yeah, no, I did not follow the trial day to day. I waited for the testimony to come up and the evidence to come up. I have a staff that works for me up in my office. They do disciplinary cases. They reviewed it. We got the Rosemarie's decision. We looked at that and we moved forward. Right here, the blonde hair.
Have you spoken to the Garner family?
I have not. Commissioner Tucker has attempted to reach out to them. A couple of different phone calls. Didn't happen too long ago. We're waiting for a call back. All the way in the corner over there.
Have you spoken to Officer Pantaleo yourself, you or your office, or is this the first time he's hearing from you?
No, this is the first time. This is the announcement was from here. What's that? I talked with Mayor de Blasio about process and possible outcomes.
Commissioner.
Ashley.
Commissioner, in her decision, Judge Nato indicated that Pantaleo was untruthful, and she also raised questions about the credibility of other officers who were not obviously on trial in this case. Can you speak about that conduct and how you felt reading that?
So this whole situation transpired in seconds. I'm sure no one in this room, if they were involved in, and no one in this room probably had to, except the police, had to arrest anybody in a physical struggle. And if they could recount step for step what they did, I think that would be nothing short of a miracle. This is the decision Rosemary made. This is, was affirmed by the first deputy commissioner, and I'm agreeing with that. Yes.
Sir, just to be clear, are you making this decision to agree with the judge, or are you making this decision because you believe it is also the right decision?
There's a department trial, there's a process. Rosemary made the decision, again, affirmed by Ben Tucker, and I agree with both of their findings.
Commissioner,
Yep.
you spoke about wishing that Eric Garner wouldn't have resisted and would have just complied. You also said you wish that Officer Pantaleo would have waited for backup. So what is the lesson for your officers coming out of this decision?
So immediately after this, back in 2014, Ben Tucker was the Deputy Commissioner of Training still at the time. We put all of our police officers through a 3-day course, including de-escalation. We've done a lot of other things. That we've done fair and impartial policing, and every police officer is wearing a body-worn camera now. There's a lot of things that came out of this incident, and every time there's an incident that affects the NYPD, there's always something to learn. Right behind you? Yep.
Commissioner, you pointed out at the beginning of your remarks about Officer Pantaleo's good record as a police officer, but he was also being monitored for 3 CCRB complaints for using use of force. How do you square those two things? And is the monitoring working, or should we have been under tighter?
Officer Pantaleo had 289 arrests. As far as we can tell, searching through all the records, no other person that he arrested was injured. He did have a number of resisting arrests, which is not unusual. He had some CCRBs. The one that was that where he was at, where it was substantiated, that was a bad stop, not use of force. So all this has to be taken in its totality. Out of that 289 arrests, there were a number of gun arrests. And what does the NYPD do each and every day? We try to reduce gun violence in this city. So that I have to look at his record. That's part of the disciplinary system. Yep.
The impact of a decision not to discipline Officer Pantaleo, impact on the community, have any factor in your decision making in this?
So I'm not going to stand up here and say I didn't think about that, but I had to be guided by the facts that were brought out in the department trial and that was sent up to our office. I see a lot of journalists here that went through 2014. The protest, the murder of Wenjen Liu and Rafael Ramos, to say that, you know, that's never out of my mind. I think about that every day, whether there's a department trial or not. So I can't stand up here and say I didn't think about that, but that's not how I made my final decision. I'll be right here.
Mayor de Blasio promised that the Garner family would get justice in this case. In explaining your decision, you referred more to the legal standards abiding by the judge's decision. Do you personally believe that this outcome constitutes justice?
This is the outcome of our trial. We needed it to be fair and impartial, and it was a fair and impartial trial. Right here with the glasses.
I know you haven't spoken to the family of Mr. Garner yet, but what would you say to them right now? From day one, we said that there was going to be a fair and impartial trial, and this is the result. Make no mistake about it. This is a tragedy for the Garner family. I fully understand that. Mr. Garner was somebody's son, somebody's dad. Everybody in the NYPD understands that. Right here.
A couple of questions. First, when is this termination effective? Is it immediate?
It's an immediate termination.
And second, reading Judge Maldonado's decision, was there anything in it that you disagreed with?
I agreed with the content of her decision. Hold on, who didn't go yet? Right here. Yeah.
Commissioner, during the departmental trial, it came out that a lot of the partner, Justice Amico, had trumped up charges on an official form for Garner's arrest. Did any part of the other people who testified come to you to say maybe they should be brought up on internal charges?
Right after this, Joe Resnick's people from Internal Affairs looked at each officer that was involved in this. There was a number of civilian witnesses, a number of police officer witnesses, and it was Sergeant Adonis received charges and Officer Pantaleo. Aaron.
Commissioner, you spoke a bit about your time as a beat cop. Did you approach this then from a position of almost reluctance? Do you want to dismiss Officer Pantaleo or empathy? Can you describe your internal deliberation?
So I can't remove myself from the fact that I was a uniformed cop for 34 years. And I think that's what makes this so difficult, that every member of law enforcement in this country that works and keeps this country safe and the city safe looked at that and said, that could possibly be me. And it's in my DNA. It's who I am. But as police commissioner, I have to think about the city, and I have to think about the rules and regs of the NYPD and make sure that people follow them. In the back.
Being a cop's cop, what's your biggest concern that this decision, the effect of it, have on your Being a cop's cop, what's your biggest concern that the department could feel be affected by this decision?
I think I stated that. I said if I was still a police officer, I would probably not be happy. But we've been through a lot of things in the NYPD, and it's great history. I know that men and women that do this job are resilient. Somebody calls for help, dials 911, somebody flags them down, they're not going to think about this decision. They're going to think about why they took this job, and they're going to help that person no matter who they are. Right here.
Before you announced your decision, you said you were confident this was the right one. Was there something in particular? Was there a moment when you realized that? And what do you see as commissioner that the officer on the street who might be upset with the decision doesn't see?
So, as I said, I went through the testimony, looked at the video a number of times. I know what the definition of a chokehold is. This is what led me to this decision. And again,
a difficult decision. In the
The
back.
New York City Police Commissioner James O'Neill explaining there. He's been going on for 30 minutes now. His decision, he says it was a painful decision, but his decision ultimately to fire, to terminate Officer Daniel Pantaleo. He was the officer held accountable for the death of Eric Garner in a chokehold more than 5 years ago, 5 years and 1 month ago. This case has dragged on for years because of Justice Department and other grand jury investigations. The police commissioner saying it was a painful decision, but he had determined that a police trial judge was correct in saying that Officer Pantaleo, yes, put Eric Garner in a chokehold, but then when they fell to the ground, had every opportunity to move to what the commissioner called less lethal alternatives as he tried to bring him into custody. Eric Garner was resisting arrest, but the police commissioner saying that the Officer Pantaleo should have stopped that prohibited chokehold. Our crime and justice reporter Shimon Prokopez has been in New York tracking all of this. Shimon, the commissioner saying he's sure a lot of men in blue and women in blue in New York City police don't like this decision today, but that he believes it's the right one.
Yeah, and John, why you're seeing him stand there for so long now, some 30 minutes, taking questions, he's really speaking in some ways to the rank and file of the police department. He knows that they're not going to be happy with this decision, and that is something that has weighed very heavily on the police commissioner. Look, I know from talking to people that this was not an easy decision for him because he was very concerned about the impact of this kind of a decision, firing this police officer, leaving him without a pension, and essentially just saying, okay, we're done with you. You violated some of the rules and regulations of the NYPD. You're now fired and you have nothing after your several years of being in the police department. Concerned him greatly. This was not a decision, as we know and as we can hear from him, he was pretty emotional at times. That came easy. The one thing we're not hearing in a lot of his statement so far is anything about the mayor. And we should not forget the role that the mayor had in all of this. Remember, it was at a CNN debate that the mayor stood up and said that the Garner family would have justice at some point. It was after the Department of Justice issued its decision not to pursue charges, not to charge the officer in this case. And all that was left for the family was whether or not the police department, the NYPD, was going to take action against Officer Pantaleo. And the mayor essentially promised this to the community, promised it to the world, saying that the family was going to get justice. And so we'll hear from the mayor in a little while. And in the coming days, we're probably going to hear stories about some of the pressure that the mayor put on the police commissioner to make sure that this officer is fired. And we'll see where it goes from there. Look, this officer will be able to sue. He's going to sue the NYPD to try and get his job back. They're going to argue in court that this is unfair. The Department of Justice did not bring charges. A prosecutor on Staten Island here in New York didn't bring charges. So there could be some recourse down the line. I can tell you, in covering the NYPD for many years and in talking to a lot of police officers, they were very worried about this decision because they felt that if the Commissioner O'Neill fires this officer, they would have no faith in him as their police commissioner. There was a lot of speculation about what the police commissioner was going to do. Was he going to resign? Was the mayor going to fire him? I can tell you there were all sorts of rumors circulating through the NYPD in the lead up to this decision. And now the police commissioner making his decision. For some, they might be surprised that this should have been an easier decision for this police commissioner, but for whatever reason, we heard him explain how he was a cop. He was looking at this from a police officer, a New York City police officer for 34 years, and having to make this decision was really, really tough for him, John.
And Shimon, in the moment we have left, just explain to anybody watching, this was 5 years and a month ago. There was an original grand jury that looked into this. They decided not to prosecute on local charges. Then it was held up, the commissioner said, because first the Obama administration, then the Trump administration, Justice Department was looking at it. So this is the end of any penalty, punishment against Officer Pantaleo, but not the end of this drama.
It is over, it is over for the officer, obviously. Look, there was a lot of infighting even at the Department of Justice at the time between the FBI, between the Department of Justice. There were people at the Department of Justice who wanted to bring charges against Pantaleo. That obviously, after Trump came in, that did not happen. But this is the end of the line here, certainly for the family. I think this is going to be good news for them, for the mayor. He's going to be happy with this outcome. And now we see, what this officer does and what the union does. And do they sue the NYPD?
Right, and we'll see that. We'll watch the legal follow-up, watch the political follow-up. Brianna Keeler picking up our coverage after a quick break.
This is CNN Breaking News.
I'm Brianna Keeler, live from CNN's Washington headquarters, and we're beginning with breaking news. Daniel Pantaleo, the New York police officer accused of fatally choking Eric Garner, has been fired. This was a decision that was just announced by the New York Police Commissioner, James O'Neill. This was moments ago. This comes, though, after 5 years, more than 5 years, after police tried to arrest the 43-year-old father of 6 for allegedly selling loose cigarettes.
A man with a family lost his life, and that is an irreversible tragedy. And a hardworking police officer with a family, a man who took this job to do good, to make a difference in his home community, has now lost his chosen career. And that is a different kind of tragedy. In this case, the unintended consequence of Mr. Garner's death must have a consequence of its own. Therefore, I agree with the Deputy Commissioner of Trials' legal findings and recommendations. It is clear that Daniel Pantaleo can no longer effectively serve as a New York City police officer.
CNN's Shimon Prokupez is following all of the developments, as is our Bryn Gingras, who is there at what was just this press conference that we saw. And Shimon, I think one of the things is that we were expecting this, where he said that he agreed with this police judge, basically, who recommended that he be fired. But hearing the police commissioner describe his rationale and also what he thought police officers would think about this, it was incredibly insightful, and I think some people are going to take issue with what they heard.
Absolutely, people are going to take issue with what he heard, and you have to understand, the police commissioner here, James O'Neill, is someone who's been a police officer, was a police officer for 34 years. He wore the uniform, he patrolled in the streets of the Bronx. He knows this city well. He has a unique relationship with many of the police officers at the NYPD because he himself was a cop for so many years, and he just went through the ranks and became the police commissioner. So what he is doing here is he's talking to really the members of the NYPD. As much as this is for us and for the community, but he's also very concerned about what the rank and file is going to think of this decision. And I know, as does Bryn, who's been talking to sources and police officers, no one on the NYPD, the rank and file certainly, they're not happy with this decision. And he is concerned about what effect that will have on their everyday jobs. So that's what we're seeing here from the police commissioner. He talked about his 34 years of service. He talked about that he does not take any pleasure, right? He says, I know that many will disagree with this decision, and that is their right. He's talking to the police officers, the people who serve this city, and the people who work for him. And he says, you know, he goes on to say there are absolutely no victors here today. Not the Garner family, not the community at large, and not the courageous men and women of this police department. So that was, in essence, a big point for him. It was important for him to stand there and take as many questions as we saw. And it was, you know, Brianna, this was a very, very difficult decision for this police commissioner. I know some might disagree with that. This seems kind of clear-cut and should have been an easy decision for him. But certainly, as we saw there from him, he was emotional at times. This was not an easy decision for him.
Bryn, I wonder if one of the things that got lost in all of this was that, yes, this was about Daniel Pantaleo's behavior in 2014 when he used a prohibited chokehold, but one of the things that we saw from this 46-page decision from this department investigation that recommended he be fired was that this was also about what the officer told investigators, that he actually told Internal Affairs that he did not use a chokehold. So she said that he was, quote, untruthful in how he went through this investigation internally.
Yeah, Brianna, and that is something that the police commissioner said he took into account, all 46 pages of that report, and really going even before his decision, the tick-tock of the events that happened on that day, from the time before this incident even happened in the area of Staten Island to the time when this incident went down, literally almost every minute that occurred. And then the fact that he said he watched the video over and over and over again and could specifically specifically point out the fact where it went wrong, where Officer Pantaleo was not in the right, which was, of course, the judge's decision. But I want to echo for you, Brianna, because, I've been in here in the room. I want to echo what Shimon said. I mean, this was such a difficult decision. I mean, I can just feel it. You feel it in this room. I mean, he was emotional. I was sitting next to the executive staff here with the NYPD. Some of them had their heads down when he actually said those words that he was going to be terminated. This was a decision the commissioner said that he didn't make within, the last couple of weeks. He said he made it just within the last couple of days, taking into account all that he could, but sticking to the facts, like, of course, any cop has to do, right? So, I mean, this was pretty emotional, not only just for the commissioner, but you can just tell for the department as a whole.
All right, you guys, stand by for me, if you will. I want to bring in Cheryl Dorsey to talk about all of this. She brings a vast perspective, 20 years in the Los Angeles Police Department before she retired as a sergeant, bringing that to this conversation. What did you think of this decision today, Cheryl?
Well, this seems to be the final chapter, but we don't know for sure because we don't know if Pantaleo will be given an opportunity to get hired by another job like Betty Shelby did after she shot and killed Terrence Crutcher, and Timothy Loman after he shot and killed Tamir Rice. And so I understand the angst that the officers are feeling. I'm a street cop, and I know that we want our leaders, our chiefs and commissioners to back us. But Pantaleo made a decision, but for his refusal to let go of that chokehold, we wouldn't be here. And now that he's been proven and demonstrated to be a liar, it's understandable that he can no longer do that job on NYPD or any other police department.
I think, family members of Eric Garner watching that press conference, they aren't going to walk away necessarily feeling good about this, because to them, they've lost their loved one, and they don't really feel like even someone being fired is enough of a response to the fact that Eric Garner is dead. What do you say to them?
Well, listen, I understand. I mean, thankfully, something was done, right? Because there was a refusal to indict, so there's no criminal penalty for this, but there are really, truly no winners. And this is not going to give the family any closure, because while Pantaleo will lose his job, he lives. He gets to go on about his day-to-day activities with his family, and they get to enjoy him in their lives, something that the Garner family has forever lost.
All right, Cheryl, thank you so much. Cheryl Dorsey with us there. I do want to talk now about 3 potential mass shootings.